This is one of my favorite games. My opponent is Grandmaster Dmitry Gurevich, and for all of the time I lived in Chicago, he pretty much owned me. I might have gotten one draw against him in all of our games, and he won all the rest. So, in this game, played shortly after I moved to California, I didn't enter the game with great expectations. I was just planning to put up the best fight I could and aim for an interesting position where I might find something creative. We start out as a Queen's Gambit, and I'm headed for the Tarrasch defense, but with this move, Gurevich is sort of telling me that he's not going to play a Knight c3 line, but he's going to use one of the Knight d2 lines. Those don't present great dangers for black, but white retains some very small advantage, and in the hands of a grandmaster, it is a little uncomfortable to head for that kind of position as black. So I switched over to the semi-Slav, where after Knight d2, as I had expected, I have the opportunity to switch to a Stonewall Dutch formation, one of my favorites, and one that I had been playing for nearly a decade at that point. Gurevich follows the main lines, except that his knight is on d2 instead of c3, and I put my pieces on the usual squares. In this particular variation, since the knight is already at d2 and the pawn is not at b3, I could have simply castled. The intent of this move is to control the a3 to f8 diagonal and prevent white from exchanging bishops by playing bishop to a3. That's not what Dmitry has in mind, but it really doesn't matter because this is the best square for the queen anyway. After queen c2, I catch up with castling, and now white needs to occupy the e5 square, because otherwise, if I can ever advance my pawn up to e5 safely, I'll be able to break open the position and have strong pressure on the e-file. So the knight jumps in immediately. I challenge it. I don't capture it right away because I don't want white to have a pawn on e5. That can be very annoying because it forces my best defensive piece, the knight at f6, to abandon its post, and it's unlikely that it can ever return there. That means that white will be able to attack on the king side without my best defender in place. So instead, I keep this knight on f6, and I put the other one on d7 so that if the knight goes to e4, I can place the d7 knight at f6. And that's the plan I start to play. But after bishop to f4, I changed my mind. White has complete control of the e5 square and is probably intending to trade off at d7 and reoccupy e5. At the same time, this is an open invitation to a kingside attack, and when playing against an opponent with superior skills, I like to attack when possible, because defense is harder than attack, and at least that way there's a chance that my opponent can make a mistake. In this game, he doesn't make a mistake for a long, long time, because he's a very good player. So he's not worried about my attack. He does exactly what I expected. He trades off some pieces and reoccupies e5. Now, there are two ways to activate the light-squared bishop in the Stonewall Dutch. Black can fianchetto at b7 under some circumstances, most easily when the knight sits at b8 to defend the pawn at c6. The other plan, seen here, is to redeploy it on the king side. Now, my knight at d6 can be chased away by c5, but after I retreat it to f7 and we exchange, if white carries out the typical plan of aiming to storm e4, I can put my bishop in a great position to defend against that plan, and then give it some scope by pushing the f-pawn. This leaves white with more problems to solve than black. So instead, after bishop e8, Gurevich wisely prevents my pawn from getting to f4. In fact, that's going to be the theme of the rest of the game. If I can eventually get my bishop on g6 and pawn advances to f4, I'm going to have a huge attack. That can't be contemplated for the moment because of the pawn at f4. So I activate my bishop and I put pressure at e2. One way of keeping your opponent from accomplishing anything actively is to tie down the pieces to defend pawns. So here, white has to keep an eye on both c4 and e2. I'm not threatening to capture anything, win any material. It's just that I'm tying down my bishop, or actually activating it, and white's tying down the queen. Well, that's got to be a big win for me. Gurevich gets ready to plan the c-file, which I'm sure is the correct strategy here, and I take measures to prepare for that eventuality. Just because the c-file is closed at the moment doesn't mean that it can't be opened, in this case quite easily by captures at d5. Now, even though I don't have a dark squared bishop, Gurevich for some reason decides to take care of his king by moving it off the diagonal that might get opened up if I play c5, for example. I'm happy to see this, and now I confront the knight at e5. Black decides to open up now, and here I have to make a decision. C takes d5 looks like the natural move, but then white can sacrifice the queen and have a tremendous control of the c-file and infiltration at c7. If I try to go pawn hunting, then after the king side opens up a little bit, I have severe problems with my king. For example, if I go and take the poisoned pawn, after a check and bishop f3, the threat of bishop h5 wins. So I have to take back with the e-pawn. Now white protects the pawn at f4, which is a very important pawn, by moving to e3, and I capture. Now he has to decide which way to recapture. Problem is that if he takes with the d-pawn, I can use my c-pawn and my d-pawn and push forward, supported by rooks, with strong counterplay. So the f-pawn has to abandon its post if he wants to avoid that, and keep the pawn at d4. Now I set up the big punch by putting my bishop in position, and white wisely steps off the diagonal. Now, some people might be tempted to play f4 as a sacrifice, but just because I own a wonderful diagonal doesn't mean much in this position, because white's king is sheltered at h1. I need to get rid of the pawn at h2. And I do so by using an h-pawn storm supported by rooks. This is very natural, but on the other hand, it's a slow plan, and there's no reason for white to panic. The correct reaction to such a plan is to play actively on the queen side, because after all the center is closed, so you can't strike there, and sometimes the best defense is a good offense. So he starts his minority attack, and I carry out my plan. Now, this is a strong defensive move because the rook at f2 can help defend the pawn at h2, and the bishop can get out of the way at f1 if necessary. I support the pawn with a rook, and he gets ready to dominate the f-file. Now I have to be careful that at some point, not in the near future, he doesn't sacrifice the exchange for a pawn at f5 just to open up my king. I don't think it's a serious problem, and in any case it's not an immediate threat, so I just continue on. Now the white king is definitely in a bad position, so the king shifts over to get out of the way. And I now push my pawn to g4, which gives me a great option. I can now, if I want to, push the pawn to h3 and completely entomb white's bishop for the rest of the game. But the position is so closed that it's not clear to me that that's the correct strategy. I'd rather go after the king. Now the king has tons of defense, but the defenders aren't pawns, and so they are inherently a little bit weaker. An escape path is made for the king, and white puts the rook where it belongs to support more play on the c-file.